My name is Ozier Muhammad. I'm originally from Chicago. I worked as a journalist, photojournalist, for over 4 decades. I first became interested in photojournalism while I was in high school. And the reason why the interest developed was because I was raised in a community that was in the news in the very early 60s through the mid 60s. There was quite a lot of reporting done on the community that I was raised in, which was the Nation of Islam. And my grandfather was actually the founder of the nation, Elijah Muhammad. So that interest was generated by him, but not only my grandfather, but also members and people who helped my grandfather to bring others into the community. People such as Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and being in that atmosphere of intense interest, and it was very controversial because of the ideology that the nation espoused. But what I loved about the attention that was drawn, in which the community was generated, that the interest that the community generated, the coverage that was done at the time was done by some of the major magazines like Life magazine, Time magazine, and I got to see people like Gordon Parks, the photographer who was the first African-American photographer at Life magazine. He spent a lot of time in the community. I saw him photograph my family members, my grandfather. I saw him hanging out with Muhammad Ali, Malcolm, and the photography that came out of that was extraordinary. And I thought, at the time, I thought, man, that's something that perhaps I could develop some skills in, and perhaps I could make a career out of it myself. And also I thought it was a noble undertaking because I thought photography or journalism in general was being was a mechanism or a medium which could actually help explain the problems that were occurring in our society based on race and also based on class, but particularly race. And because of the nation's involvement with the racial issue and also the efforts that were underway by the civil rights movement, I thought that journalism, and I still feel today that journalism was something that was very important in regards to helping to liberate people, bring attention to the struggles that people were having, the injustices that were occurring at the time in the 60s when I was a teenager. So my interest started to peak at that time, and I started to really pay attention to the medium. And when I finished high school, I decided that I would go to college. I really wanted to go to college, and I sort of floundered around in some community colleges before I eventually found a college that I thought was a good fit for me, and that was Columbia College in Chicago. And Columbia College today is still a liberal arts college with a heavy emphasis on the medium, broadcast medium, photography, and also film. So I took a lot of photography courses, and I started to freelance a bit when I was at Columbia. And by the time I finished Columbia College, graduated in 1972, I I started to freelance even more. And I, at that time, had established a relationship with Johnson Publications, which publishes Ebony Magazine and Jet Magazine. So I made the pilgrimage to New York after graduating in the late spring of 1972. What I mean by that pilgrimage is all the big publishing houses were mostly located here in New York City. I live in New York City now. There were a few in Chicago, but they were mostly here. And I had already started freelancing for Ebony and Jet. So when I came to New York, I had got a list of places that were recommended to me by Herbert Nipson, who was the executive editor of Ebony. And he gave me a list. He made some phone calls for me, and I came up to New York. And I went by Time Magazine, Life Magazine. I stopped at Black Enterprise, Essence Magazine. I also stopped into the offices of the Ebony Bureau in New York and met Moneta Sleet Jr., who was the first African-American photographer to win the Pulitzer Prize. He won that Pulitzer Prize photographing Coretta Scott King and her daughter, Yolanda, at the funeral of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When I finished my trip to New York, I returned to Chicago, and about a week after returning to Chicago, Herbert Nipson calls me and offers me a job at Ebony Magazine. So that's how my career began. It was a bit of a surprise to get a call from, we called him Nip for short, Herbert Nipson. And I said to Nip, I said, well, why did you give me all those recommendations, send me on this expensive trip to New York to show my portfolio around when you had in mind perhaps to hire me anyway? And we sort of got a chuckle out of that. He thought that, well, he was negotiating with the publisher of the magazine whether to hire me or not, but his intent was to try to convince the publisher to bring me on board. But at any rate, as far as photojournalism goes, I think that it's not an exaggeration to describe the institution of journalism as the fourth estate. I really feel that if we did not have a free press or the institution of journalism or the so-called fourth estate, you know, the first estate being the judiciary and then the legislature and gosh, what's the other one? The executive, right? If we didn't have the fourth one, we wouldn't have the oversight that's needed. And also, I think that photojournalism, or journalism in particular, is so crucial to constantly reminding people in powerful positions that what they do is being scrutinized in regards to fairness and justice and equity.